Well, welcome to Tim's Take today, and we're in for a double treat because we have two guests. The first one is Dr. Harley Nauman. He's our State Extension Forage and Grazing Management Specialist. And the other one is Dr. Eric Bailey. He's our State Extension Beef Nutrition Specialist. And the reason we have these together because today we're going to talk about what we can do to have supplemental pasture feeding during the summer. Because often the drought hits and we think, oh my gosh, how am I going to feed my livestock? And it's too late then. So let's think about this a little bit ahead of time. So let's start off with just a general conversation. Harley, is this a big issue?
It's a big issue for sure. And you mentioned drought. I'd like to mention one other aspect of our production systems, and that's the summer slump, right? So that's a predictable problem that we have.
With our tall fescue, or cool season grasses in general.
Right, in general, with our, it doesn't have to just be tall fescue, but our mixed cool season perennial pastures are going to slow in their production, usually around the beginning of summer, and they're going to stay that way through most of the summer and even into the early fall. And that, again, like I said, is a predictable issue. So we know that's coming. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there's the potential for the drought or abnormally dry periods, right? In the past, I'd say since the year 2000, if you look at the data generated by the models in the U.S. Drought Monitor, since the year 2000, we've had 1 year where somewhere in Missouri did not experience at least an abnormally dry period. And so I'd say that abnormally dry periods are the rule rather than the exception. And so what we have here today is an opportunity to talk about what are some ways that we can start planning for both the summer slump and these highly probable abnormally dry periods that we're going to deal with.
Because, Eric, we got to watch the nutrition, too. Just not having some feed out there. We got to look at having some good quality feed.
Well, and, cool season grasses, they switch from their vegetative stage of production to the reproductive stage of production in that late spring period, right? They put a stem and a seed head up. Stems and seed heads are associated with more lignin, more structural carbohydrates, lower nutritive value, both in terms of energy and crude protein. And so, if you think about it in a spring calving, or as I like to call it, a winter calving model, like we do in Missouri pretty commonly, right? A lot of times we're coinciding peak lactation, which are the highest nutrient requirements for a cow, with the start of this summer slump. So we're also, when we need our best diets, when we have forage quality declining, and so for a beef cow to rebreed, as you all talked about in your last podcast, she needs to stay on a 365-day calving interval. She needs to be rebred within 85 days of calving. So any delays to her resuming estrus after that postpartum interval can be largely impacted by declines in forage quality, declines in the nutritive value of her diet. And so there's kind of a perfect storm right there, at least in our conventional model, for reductions in forage quality. But then at the same time, we've also got the decline in forage production. Drought will exacerbate declines in forage availability.
So if we have February calves, for example, when's peak lactation end?
So peak lactation is generally thought to be about 60 days post-calving. So, the thing that I tell people that I don't think we think about enough, so you say that your calving season starts February 1, but if you calve for 60 days, and calves have an equal probability of being born at any day of the calving season, the average birth date is March 1.
Okay.
If your calving season is extended longer than that, if you've got a 90-day calving season, then your average calf is born more like March 15th, which would make peak lactation be roughly May 15th. And essentially, lactation looks like a big curve. So you get a big increase in nutrient demands with calving and then a slow, steady decline afterwards. So it's not this, back to baseline. It's this and then this going kind of a gentle curve downwards afterwards. So your nutrient requirements are high anyway. Plus that calf is getting larger, starting to eat some feed, some forage themselves, starting to graze. So you do see that kind of double whammy, both of needs for forage needs for milk production and forage needs for that calf as well.
So it's going to be high May 1 till at least through July.
Absolutely.
And that is, like you said, that's our cool season grasses have already went reproductive.
Yep.
Probably already been hayed off or grazed off, or even our legumes are starting to, middle of the summer, they start going down.
Yep.
So, but our peak is needed. So what are we going to do? So what's some options in Harley? What can we do?
Well, there are a lot of different options out there from a forage standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I can contribute here. So you just mentioned legumes, for example, and if you're in a typical system that we might see around here, where you've got a predominantly tall fescue based pasture, of course there's orchard grass in there, and there's Kentucky bluegrass, and there's some of these other things, but oftentimes you see red and white clover as well. That red and white clovers, it's not going to do much for you in those summer months, right? And so if we have the right legume, then perhaps we're not seeing quite a reduction in the legume and that contribution to forage quality.
Because really, red and white clover are cool season legumes, aren't they?
Right.
They peak out just probably as the cool season grasses do.
Pretty much, right? So if we've got systems where we're putting some annual Lespedeza in there, right? It's a warm season legume. It tolerates pretty poor soil fertility, which we might say we characterize a lot of our soils in Missouri as poor fertility, low phosphorus, that sort of thing. Then that's a good legume to have that's going to track on through the summer.
And we can overseed that in the late spring. I mean, spring or late winter, spring.
I would say you're overseeding that in late winter to early spring. It works in a frost seeding model as well.
February, March.
Sure.
Overseed it. So,
yep.
Okay. And it's a perennial.
No, it's an annual.
Oh, that's right. But it reseeds itself so easy.
Yep. So it's pretty interesting. It's an annual that it can behave or persist sort of perennially, right? But you've got to manage for that. So if you're not a great grazing manager, for example, and you don't
Eric,
if you don't allow it to reseed, right? If you don't give it a little bit of rest to reseed, then it's not going to persist very well. But if you give it a chance to rest and reseed there towards the end of the summer, then you'll have annual Lespedeza persist in your pastures pretty well.
Well, I've seen it because it gets in my yard too.
Sure.
And I've seen it just really short, producing seeds, blooming late in the summer and producing seeds.
Yeah.
I suppose
it doesn't take much.
Right.
Just a little bit of rest, and it'll.
So if you can pull them off in August or something, give them an opportunity.
Yep.
And all right, so that's one of our warm season Lespedeza. I mean, legumes.
Sure.
What sun hemp?
Sun hemp's another option. This is one that, it's not, as far as legumes go, it's not going to be the super high quality or high nutritive value legume. It's got some stem to it. It's got a lot of fiber. It's mostly highly digestible fiber, so it's a good legume to have, but it's not this over the top high protein forage crop. And so in some regards, that makes it kind of a good option for a lot of our systems here in Missouri. I let Eric speak to that a little bit, but it's certainly one that you could think about adding, and it's one that you'd add a little bit later.
Right. You could after you cut hay or graze it in the spring, you could come in with it. You could drill it in.
That's right. Yeah. Typically after you've grazed your perennial cool season grass pretty well, or if you've done a hay event, then it's usually prime time to turn around and you could drill or broadcast sun hemp into your pastures and have it grow with your fescue regrowth.
And you said give it like 50 days or something like that?
Yeah, typically between 45 and 55 days is usually when it's ready to go, when it's ready to harvest. Yep.
And they could graze it, or you could harvest it for hay.
You could. I mean, we prefer that you graze it. It works a lot better in a grazing system, I
Sure.
think, than hay. But certainly, if you're looking for a summer legume hay, it's an option.
All right. Now, so how do those fit with the nutritional needs of our livestock?
That's a great question, Tim, and I think it speaks to a broader conversation. An observation that I've had in the nearly 8 years that I've lived in Missouri now is that we have some cattle guys that are very, very good managers of their genetics, of their management system for their cattle. They produce good cattle, but they don't do a great job with their forages, right? So I know that you can think of farms that you've driven by that, great cattle, pretty poor forage management. On the other hand, we see a lot of farms that are great grass managers who maybe don't quite have their cattle operation dialed in quite so much. And so one of the things that I appreciate so much about Dr. Nauman and we're housed in the same office suite now, so we get to collaborate a lot more because of our proximity to one another. We can have these conversations with folks that you got to think about this in the broader context of a system, right? And there's multiple components to this system. So, I'm not dodging your question, but I want to put a little broader context to it because, right, there's two parts to this. There's the nutritive value of the forage, which we discussed earlier, but then there's also just simply forage availability, right? So, if we don't have anything for them to graze, if that fescue, we generally think of tall fescue being between 250 and 400 pounds of forage dry matter per inch of height across an acre. So an acre inch is how I'm going to refer to that, right? So when we graze these pastures down below that kind of 4-inch threshold that we tell folks, we really start to see marked declines in forage intake by beef cattle because we know that in general a beef cow is going to graze about 8 hours a day. She's going to rest about 8 hours a day, and she's going to ruminate about 8 hours a day. And forage availability impacts bite size, how much feed she consumes per bite. But we're not going to change number of bites a whole lot in that system. And so we need to have that forage available. So what I think is an important piece to this conversation is that we need something available for them to graze as well in the summer months, right? And so I think that's where Dr. Nauman's work is so important. I say this also to bring up the point that I guess how I envision the implication of these summer annuals being implemented on these farms is you've got first a managed grazing system. So you've got multiple paddocks to go to, right? And so, I think folks will hear our prescriptions on podcasts, at talks, in extension guide sheets, newspaper, popular press articles, and they think that they need to go do their entire farm. Really, the way that you could be most effective with it is to implement it on a component or a piece of your farm, some of your paddocks, but not all of your paddocks, right? So that you allow for that proper rest to occur, right? For annual Lespedeza to regenerate, or you give sun hemp that 6 weeks to get ready before you graze it. One of the biggest mistakes that a lot of people are going to make in the state of Missouri is they're going to have reached that kind of 100 days of hay feeding threshold. They're going to be kicking cows out right now because they're chasing green. They see some green grass out in their pastures, but there's no forage height out there. And so then what happens is that the cows are eating this super high nutritive value feed, and they get very loose in their manure, and I'll hear complaints about the grass is too washy, it's going right through the cows. Well, the reality is there's just not enough dry matter out there for these cows right now. That mistake gets repeated again in the summer months. And so, when we implement these summer annuals in a forage system, we need to have that forage system wrangled, and we need to think about maybe targeted application of it to certain pieces of your forage system to really maximize the grazing value out of it. Because I don't want to speak for Dr. Nauman or even for you, Tim, but for me, if I'm going to plant something, I want to graze it because it's 2 to 3 times the cost to hay it as it is to graze it. And I know a lot of folks that are doing native warm season grasses, they're doing sun hemp, they're doing sorghum Sudan, and they're turning around and baling it. And so you're already investing on the establishment side, but then you're doubling down on the harvesting side, and you're making some pretty expensive forage. And in an era of $4 corn, $4.50 per bushel corn, there's probably cheaper calories out there than moderate to low quality hay that I paid to establish, I paid to harvest, I paid to store, and I paid to feed.
So what would be the ideal because I have to have some baled hay. So do I do that in May, get my baled hay, and after that I'm all managing my fields?
It's a great question. I mean, I think if you're going to put the expense forth to make hay, my opinion is you should make good hay. And for us in our cool season perennial pastures, I mean, making good hay means making hay in May, earlier if the opportunity is there. Before, and really maybe we throw the calendar out the window and we don't want to put a month on it. Maybe we just say before we start to transition out of vegetative forage into reproductive forage, that's when we need to be making hay if we're going to make it. Just so we're not putting the cost out there to make poor quality hay, right? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But oftentimes that's what we see out there is, hay being made in July, sometimes in August, right? Sometimes even later. And so we're making a really expensive, poor quality product at that point.
40% of the cost is in the machinery well, I heard one farmer say, if you're honest with yourself, you got $40 per bale just the machinery cost.
I don't disagree with that, but I'll advocate actually for a zero hay system. So
right.
I've gone far enough in my career. I'm out. I'm not going to try and advocate to reduce from 120 days to 90 days or 90 days to 60 days. Hay should be thought of by farmers as an insurance policy.
Right.
That was the way that we did it in New Mexico because it was so expensive. We always had a semi-load of hay in the barn to feed if we had a blizzard, if we had a wildfire, if we ran out of forage and we were in a bind. But incorporating it as a normal component of our production system increases our costs. Hay, it's insane that we're talking about $1,600 weaned calves, and our cost of production, at least if you look at the extension cow-calf budgets released in fall of 2024, showed cost of productions of $1,720 a cow. And our largest expense, our largest two expenses are pasture and stored forage.
So we have record high prices. But we're still losing the $100 a head.
Yes, absolutely. Now, I will say, so we'll get a lot of pushback from farmers on that. There's two things that these budgets do that farmers don't count. Labor, right? So $195 a cow in labor is what's estimated on those budgets under those constraints. And then another $400 per cow in replacement costs. So that's, we turn 15 to 20% of a cow herd over in a year. The cost of developing heifers or buying bred heifers, and then the cost of those cows who haven't paid for themselves before they're culled, right? So that cow depreciation is bundled up in that cow replacement. And so those are two significant costs that farmers don't write a check for that should be counted against their business, right? Because they're non-cash costs, but they're expenses, no doubt. Now, we're getting a little too animal-y for this. I don't want to steal the topic at hand away.
But they're melded together.
But they're absolutely melded together. And the big piece that I want to drive the point home before we move on to something else, the system that we're describing that requires hay utilizes 100% of your farm's carrying capacity for cows. You have all of your eggs in a single basket, and that single basket requires feed 365 days a year. Yet, we're asking of a forage system where the average growing season is less than 240 days a year, and Dr. Nauman could probably sharpen that number up, right? And so we're creating the conditions where we have to carry forage forward. We have to stockpile for 4 months out of the year, for a third of the year, right? And so what I advocate for is not having all of your eggs in a single basket, having multiple grazing enterprises. So cows, if you want to have cows, great. But have the ability to have a secondary or even a tertiary enterprise that's not on the farm year round so that you can vary your stocking rate, because your stocking rate ought to vary with your pasture forage production potential, right? So in the spring, we generally have more grass than we know what to do with for about 90 days, right? And then we're forage poor for basically the rest of the year. The premise of this conversation today was simply to talk about strategies maybe to extend that forage growth curve, right? But we also have to think about the system that we're utilizing with it. We probably need, I say this at meetings and I get a lot of pushback from it, but I believe it. Every farm in the state of Missouri that feeds hay for 90 days a year would be more profitable profit, not revenue. Too many producers get those mixed up with 10% fewer cows than what they have today. I'm convinced. I'm absolutely convinced. So that's as we think through this, nutritive value of these summer annuals. Also, we should ask whether we're going to make more money harvesting that forage with a growing calf versus a mature brood cow.
Right. So, and I think you told us one time, like in those months that we have more than forage than what we know what to do with, we could put stockers out there.
Absolutely.
Buy some stockers, but then you sell them after 3 months. But now you're back in the summer, and you still have your pregnant you have pregnant cows that have high demand from the lactation.
Yep, absolutely. I don't disagree with that one bit. And one thing that we've been talking about here recently, if you look at sale reports, pregnant cows seem to be undervalued. Pregnant mature cows, particularly first period of gestation, fall calving cows right now, for whatever reason, they seem to be a little bit undervalued in the marketplace. And so you don't even have to think about stockers. In fact, I'm working with a farm family over near Pilot Grove right now, helping them figure out their own version of my double stock concept, but with cows instead. And so we're actually using P1 bred cows, 4 to 8 year old cows, buying those instead of stockers and carrying them all through the fall. So it makes these conversations about summer annual forages even more important, right? Especially as we're thinking about, nutrient requirements of a late gestation cow increase significantly, right? I think you've had Dr. Meyer on before to talk about the impacts of, developmental programming, right? And developmental programming in a nutshell really sort of comes down to the fact that maybe we're underfeeding those animals at a really critical time for fetal development.
In that last trimester.
Last trimester, exactly.
Yes. So if we're going to do hay, let's do good quality hay. If we've got to have it.
Yep.
But then let's manage our pastures.
Well, and one of the things, there was a couple things Dr. Bailey mentioned in there that I think are really important to think about, right? He said something about grazing to a 365 day a year, right? Mm-hmm. And then another thing that was mentioned was carrying capacity and maybe how we could do better on 10% fewer head, right? I mean, just doing the calculation and figuring out what is your actual carrying capacity. And just because your carrying capacity is X doesn't mean we need to be stocked at X, right? So if we're stocked under our carrying capacity, and if we develop our carrying capacity to a 365-day grazing season, we're going to be putting our better foot forward, right, than if we're spending a bunch of time out there chasing our tails, trying to plant forages when we're going to need them, trying to put up hay so that we can, graze at this particular stocking rate that we've decided we need to have for whatever reason, right? So,
but with land values the way they are, you may have to make the most of what you've got too. So you may have to be a little bit more intensive.
Well, let's be candid and honest about it. If you look at it, I've done the math on this, right? So I'm 38 years old. I got a young family. I would really like to have a big spread someday. But even in the current market conditions, the best system that I could create where I minimized my inputs in iron and oil, equipment, basically, and labor, a grazing operation is going to cash flow about $2,500 an acre land cost. Anything above that, your cash flow becomes negative. And so then you end up in that trap where you subsidize your farm with off-farm income, right? And so I think that's the trap that we have seen for generations in the state of Missouri, where we start small farm, we work in town to subsidize the farm, we grow the farm to about the point where you get to be 45, 50 years old, the farm is large enough to support an income. Well, now you've got two jobs, right? Two full-time jobs, and you end up kind of prematurely wore out in that system. And I think we got to have, there's a reckoning coming for that, right? Because my generation, I would hope that we're not going to accept that path, because that's a traditional model, and that's quite honestly an unreasonable model going forward, I believe personally. So I'm trying to create systems where my agriculture enterprise is cash flow positive, and so that it will support a greater value on the land. It'll pay for more of the land. I think that's we talk a big game about wanting to bring the next generation back to the farm. The number one reason we don't bring the next generation back to the farm is we don't generate enough cash flow. Period. That's now we're way the heck off topic, and Harley's wondering why did I go tell Eric to come down and join this podcast this morning? But that's part of this whole conversation, because and there's one more metric that we need to discuss, right? That sort of underpins this entire deal: pounds of beef produced per acre per year. How many pounds of beef do we produce per acre? And how do we do that in context with the carrying capacity of the farm? What will the carrying capacity of the farm allow versus, our inputs in iron and oil?
Well, let's talk about next time then. Our next part of this podcast is about how we can increase that carrying capacity. Because I think that's really fits part of our summer program too, doesn't it?
You bet.
All right. So this is it for today's Tim Take. Next week, we'll have the conclusion of this, where we're going to look more on carrying capacity and how we could improve that. We'll see you next time.